Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now to our guest.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. My guest today is Linda Scotson. She's the developer of what's called the Linda Scotson Technique. It has to do with breathing to help people that are in various medical situations. Yeah, well, just tell me a bit about your technique. It's called the Linda Scotson Technique, but I don't know what that means. So tell listeners about your technique and how you came to be where you are.
Yes. So I began 43 years ago when my son was seriously brain injured. I'd been widowed. I had a young daughter. I was told that his condition was hopeless. There was a very bad blood incompatibility. It was very well written up, and he wouldn't be able to see, hear, move, relate to the world about him. And I was told to give him phenobarbital and take him home. And, well, actually, they said I should put him into care, but extraordinary, because I obviously was full of love for him. So I did the most, to me, sensible, immediate thing that I could do. I put him back against my skin. And I kept him close to me all the time. The health visitors would come in and say, why have you got him on you all the time? Extraordinary, because there was a lot of love flowing between us, but B, he was getting my breathing. He was getting my breathing, and he was getting my movement. He was getting my heartbeat. And I was also celebrating his birth for him. I thought he deserved that. And actually, 2 months on from doing this, he did seem appreciably better. Unfortunately, then, he had kidney failure, so it was a month in Guy's Hospital with kidney failure. And then when he came out, and they were amazed that he'd survived, I continued with this. And I worked in many different ways, trying to move his limbs in rhythmical movements, trying to do things that I felt would actually help his breathing even then, because I could see it wasn't quite right. I had another child. I could see his rib cage was flaring out to the side more than it should. And sometimes he seemed very catching his breath. So I did many things with him. And the things that I did, which were also going back as far as I could in time, appreciably helped him. And to the extent that I was persuaded to write a book about him. And that became a bestseller. So I got to know a lot of people with children with problems, but I could see that I hadn't got far enough with him. Actually, he could walk, which was extraordinary, and he could see, and clearly he had some hearing with hearing aids, but he...
What was your son's condition? What was it called? What is it called?
Well, it was called cerebral palsy, severe athetoid cerebral palsy. But what prompted it was something called connectors, is a blood incompatibility, where the mother's blood works against the blood group of the child she is carrying, treats the child she is carrying as an invader, tries to get rid of it. So it creates this yellow bile pigment, which poisons the brain and also makes the baby very yellow for a while too. So it's a very serious, well-documented condition. So they couldn't really say to me, we must have made a mistake, because with a bilirubin count as high as Doran's, you wouldn't make a mistake. And I more or less did the opposite of most things that I had been told. But I could see as he was getting older, above the age of 6, he was still quite floppy, although he could walk, and he wasn't really able to speak. Although I felt he was bright, I didn't think that he really had a very sophisticated understanding of what was going on around him, except in terms of play and being with me. I felt there's far more to Doran to be unlocked. I sent a copy. I didn't have a television, but some kind soul lent me a television and told me to look at what was called a Horizon program on the brain. And there was a Professor Patrick Wall, who was head of the Cerebral Studies Department at London University, speaking about brain plasticity. And it was very fascinating. It coincided with my own thoughts. So I sent him a copy of the book, and he invited me up to meet him. I also explained to him what I thought. I thought that the problems with recovery of function after a brain injury in children were not just to do with the brain. The main problem was that the respiratory system had been affected. And I had some other kind soul had lent me some textbooks in physiology. So I'd been able to see that the main respiratory muscle, which is the diaphragm, which was clearly weak in Dawn, which is under the bottom part of the rib cage, just slightly above the bottom of the sternum, that's the breastbone, going down towards the bottom of the rib cage. This muscle, which looks, fairly uninteresting, actually is a phenomenal muscle. It is a pump that pumps the deoxygenated blood from the veins back to the heart, and in fact the deoxygenated blood from all the organs and tissues of the body back to the heart. And the amount of oxygenated blood that can get into the brain is determined by the amount of deoxygenated blood that can be removed. So if your diaphragm is weak and you've got a brain injury, then the flow of blood round and through the little capillaries near to the damaged area, that's going to be missed quite a bit.
Okay, quick question here. What does it mean to have a weak diaphragm? And how does someone know if they have a weak diaphragm?
It's very easy, really, because your diaphragm is also your main postural muscle. So if you tend to sit with your back a little bent or your shoulders a little forward, if you can't keep your head quite in the midline, it's quite a sweet position to keep it, but a little to the left, a little to the right, then the likelihood is that what is underlying this postural anomaly, or it's not quite such an anomaly, because many people do have weaker diaphragms simply by sedentary work all the time. But of course, when it's a brain injured child, it's another problem, and it always happens. It always happens after a brain injury, because this is the story goes on, if I can just go quickly, because obviously I didn't have this information until I got to university. So I'm trying to do it in a bit of a sequence. The lovely thing about Professor Wall was he didn't treat me as an artist who didn't really know what they were talking about. Well, he obviously had asked me up there. He said, look, what you're saying is very interesting, but I think you would like to put it more scientifically. Why don't you phrase it like this? And he kept helping me in this way. And then he found somebody who would help me to do some research on the breathing of the children. I still didn't know the origin of the problem. I could see it was there, but I didn't know its origin. And finally he said, I think you should do a PhD. There are PhDs who don't have first degrees in science in this department. You can do 3 years in one, and I think you should be in the psychology department, which was a wise choice. So I'll find someone to back for you. And I think you're up to it. So I said, oh, right, yes, I'll do that. So then it was a long time ago. There was no internet, really. So I had the university library. And in the library, I found literature that told me some very revealing things. And one of these was that if there was a drop in oxygen to the brain, it's called hypoxia. If there was a drop in oxygen to the brain, then there will be a compensatory redirection of blood supply away from the fetus's lungs and diaphragm to the brain, to help the brain. Now, this may work in many people. There may be a slight weakness somewhere, but it just gives them their character. But they have a mark on their respiratory system, which, if placed under further stresses in later life, can actually contribute to or even cause a poor health state of one kind or another. And unfortunately, clinicians don't look that far back. You have a lot of symptoms, but they tend to treat the symptoms with the pharmacological products rather than look back in time and try to establish why it's your liver, your kidneys, your pancreas, your lungs that are a problem. And in fact, when you understand the work the diaphragm does, you'll see that it is a multifunctional organ on which the health of all the other organs in your body really depend. If you had a brain injury, then the situation is much worse, because now you've got dead cells and broken blood vessels in your brain, and what they need to optimize, what that area of the brain needs to optimize functionally, is increased amount of oxygen in the vulnerable area. But now you're not going to get it because your diaphragm is too weak to provide. So your diaphragm
What does that mean? So if you have a weak diaphragm, what happens when you breathe? What does that mean? You're not getting enough oxygen? What is happening in the breathing process?
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now, back to the show.
What happens is not that you're not getting enough oxygen, because you'd be very sick if you were. There are respiratory adaptations that take place because blood supply produces electrical activity. So the diaphragm, full of blood, is electrically active, and the respiratory centers in the brainstem can detect it. Diaphragm's working, everything is well. Diaphragm is not working so well. We have to switch respiratory control. So they switch the respiratory control to the upper chest and to the abdomen to support the diaphragm. So breathers can be very varied. The diaphragm may be very underdeveloped and small, or it may be weak and flat and exhausting itself all the time and supported by these 2 other positions. But nothing can beat a diaphragm. So your respiratory, circulatory, postural system is not going to be working so well because you've got a weaker diaphragm. When you were born, your diaphragm is very flat. I have some pictures of it, but of course we're not visual, are we? So it's a beautiful, beautiful crimson dome. It's full of blood vessels because it's got such a huge network of nerves. So the phrenic nerve, which is the diaphragm nerve, that comes from the neck, it divides into, and it goes each side of the diaphragm, then it splits in 4, and then this huge network of nerves grows. But to grow nerves and to feed nerves, they need blood supply, so they need blood vessels. So if there are not enough blood vessels, the nerves simply will work less efficiently to send the signals for the beautiful crimson diaphragm to do its work so efficiently. Also, the diaphragm should be provided with what is called fatigue-resistant muscle fibers, because it has to keep going and it has to keep meeting each new challenge for oxygen as we make it. So this means that there is an inherent weakness there. So again, you're using your upper chest. Now, if you use your upper chest, let's say that you don't have any particularly marked brain injury, but you're an upper chest breather. So breathing with the upper chest, that's equivalent of emotional breathing. We have 2 sorts of breathing, 2 main sorts of breathing. One with the upper chest when you're emotional, when you're excited, when you're anxious, and the diaphragm breathing. So the upper chest breathing creates arousal. Oh, I must remember that. I'll remember to meet at 6 o'clock or 6:30. But you're only meant to be aroused for a moment. Then you should breathe down with your diaphragm in order to make the appropriate plan and to carry on with your day until the moment when you have to get ready for the meeting. So this arousal is laid down through a part of the brain called the limbic system, which changes your breathing pattern in relation to your emotions and also gives you a very focus. So you're focusing within the context of this brain structure. And that means you can be very clear and very quick, but you can't connect with a lot of other things. So people usually think about it in terms of flight or fight. If you're trying to get out of a burning building, then you don't want to think of where you left your handbag or your briefcase or anything else, any other complicated thing. You just want to get out. And you don't really want to speak or listen to anything very much except a very simple order. Okay, then of course you've got to run, and in the course of running you come down to diaphragmatic breathing again. But we do this for much more minor events all the time, I'm sure you'll recognize.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
If you get stuck breathing here, which is very easy to do, then you start to be getting anxious, you can get panic attacks, you can get post-traumatic stress to a larger or smaller degree, because you're going over and over and over this information that's been laid down in your limbic system. Whereas once you breathe again with your diaphragm, then remember, your diaphragm is responsible for changing respiratory rate and depth. It's feeding the whole brain. Your upper thoracic breathing is meant to be going much more directly into this focused, immediate reaction in the limbic system. Okay?
Yeah, do you have a protocol for people that suffer anxiety?
Yes, it's wonderful. It's so wonderful. Once you understand it, once you understand that it's not something that was intended to be in your character. What probably happened was, because actually most problems in later life are created before we are born. They're laid down before we are born. It's called the fetal origins hypothesis, and it's been well documented by various professors in England. So this means that suppose before you were born or just after, there was a slight drop in oxygen around some of the structures in the limbic system. So this means that you are more likely to be trapped in that system, thinking over and over and over again of some topic that causes you anxiety, concern, worry. And when you're breathing with your upper chest, you're reducing the blood oxygen to your diaphragm. So the balance in the brain has gone. You're focusing on those brain structures. There's enough blood supply there to intensely focus on those brain structures and what has been recorded there, which has been either something that was pleasant or unpleasant, and it will tend to repeat it. It's trying to remind you, it's trying to be helpful. But under normal circumstances, your brain would reconnect with other areas of information, and that would then recharacterize that event. Oh, well, we don't really have to worry so much about that because of this. And anyway, that only just happened.
You mean like you can deliberately couple different types of breathing styles to what you're experiencing to change your experience?
Yes, absolutely, yes. Breathing very much characterizes your experience, and anybody could do it. They can make themselves very anxious by breathing up here for any length of time. And that's where you get panic attacks, because of course if you're breathing up there for any length of time, oxygen levels are dropping, which makes you panic. So you breathe more like that. You don't need a pill. You need to change your breathing.
Oh, yeah, I've heard people go, I can't breathe. Yes. And they're like, yeah, I understand what you mean.
Yes.
A quick thought occurred. So when you're going through a particular experience, an emotional experience, or let's say you're even studying to learn material, can you use your breathing to, I guess, completely change how you experience emotions? Or if you're trying to learn something, can you do it to help you learn better?
You can. Sometimes this is difficult, which is why if you understand how to just gently increase the blood supply back into your diaphragm again by the light, gentle pressures which I developed, which really copy the internal pressures of breathing within the body and their effect on the microcirculation and I suppose the magnetic fields as well. But you can just think about the tiny blood vessels. You're just slightly compressing and decompressing. So you're creating pulses of blood, increasing blood through your diaphragm. So then the respiratory center re-identifies the diaphragm and you come down and breathe with your diaphragm. So that's an easier way of doing it than trying to alter your breathing pattern. If you've been a habitual upper thoracic breather, you can try and you may be able to do it. But until your diaphragm is a bit stronger, it will be more tricky. Once your diaphragm is stronger, it becomes automatic.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I'm imagining if you take a deep breath and if you direct your breath to the bottom of your belly, or let's say to your back or to your front, the breath, I guess, would push against all the material inside you.
Yes, it does.
And compress it and make a lot of secondary and tertiary effects from that, right?
Yes, this is so obvious. It's so obvious. And again, there are lots of papers that refer to this. You know, during fetal development, the diaphragm moves. It's called fetal breathing. And this actually starts at 2 months of age. But around 3 months before birth, it's becoming really frequent and strong. And these little movements of the flat, underdeveloped fetal diaphragm put pressure against the lungs, and it is known that this triggers the switching on of the genetic material in the lungs. Pressure is becoming recognized as a trigger for switching on genetic material. Pressure and the presence of oxygen. I think if you remember, about 3 years ago, 3 scientists got the Nobel Prize for showing that the presence of oxygen in the cell was a trigger for the cell switching on its genetic material and maintaining it. Though, if you think logically, why would a cell switch on its genetic material if it wasn't having any oxygen and it wasn't having any information? Because life is movement. We never stop moving because we never stop breathing. So all the time, these little gentle pressures against the cell membrane are occurring. And this is giving information, more and more information, and it connects everything up. Too long, I think, we've seen all our organs in isolation from one another. They're actually all connected by the diaphragm. And human development is driven by diaphragmatic breathing.
I know, again, we're not visual right now. We are on a podcast, but are you able to describe one method of breathing that people can practice while they're listening to change their state? And what will it do?
Well, it's useful to know that the diaphragm descends when you inhale. Many people think that it must ascend to lift the chest, but when you think a little bit more logically, the descent of the diaphragm allows the lungs to inflate much more. So you need to have space. The diaphragm is connected to all your internal organs, your pelvic floor. The whole lot move up and down when you breathe. So what a good inhalation is the diaphragm flares out slightly to the sides and moves down. And it's the dome flattens, but doesn't flatten completely. So it's still got sides to it, which are pushing slightly on the walls of the rib cage. So what you don't want to try and do is push your belly in and out, just using the abdominal muscles to do that. That just goes out naturally while space is being made for the descending diaphragm. Good breathing, if you put your hands just around your lower rib cage with your fingertips just touching. So when you breathe in, you should feel those fingertips just parting a little bit because the diaphragm should be moving out to the sides. And if you put your hand on over your navel, you should just feel a little movement there, but not one that you've made yourself. You haven't attempted to move your abdominal muscles. You can just feel the expansion of your lungs as the diaphragm drops. And that's such a refreshing, good feeling. But as soon as you start to breathe up with the upper chest, it becomes more stressful for the whole body. But many people do that all the time because this is the way they think they should breathe. And the little problematic consequences are not related to the way you breathe or to because they're related directly to circulation in the upper body, circulation in the lower body, emotional state, so many consequences. We hook in on ourselves because we don't breathe optimally. And it's not easy. You can go to the gym You can go to your yoga class or your Tai Chi class, but if your diaphragm is weaker and you can't really identify it, your reaction will be to use any muscle to create the illusion that you're using your diaphragm, and you'll be tired and you won't be satisfied, and you'll see your other friends in the class doing quite well, and you'll wonder, why can't I do this?
What's wrong with belly breathing or trying to deliberately breathe into different parts of your body?
Well,
Worse somewhat, but...
No, what I'm saying is nothing wrong when your belly moves because it's your diaphragm moving. But when you're moving your belly because your abdominal muscles are doing it, that's artificial. It doesn't mean that the abdomen is being displaced because the diaphragm is descending. You see? If you're breathing up, your belly will go out. So yes, right. So you are belly breathing, but you're not deliberately trying to move your abdominal muscle.
Well, I can see like you could do it. You could do it two ways. It looks like you could push your belly out and breathe, and like you said, you think you're breathing into your belly. Or I guess you could breathe and let your diaphragm push your belly out.
Yes,
but maybe
now
focus your attention there so that you lead.
Yeah, that's what it's intended to be. You can direct your attention to different spots as you breathe, as long as you're thinking of the breath. You can move your breath anywhere because your circulation, your breath, your diaphragm creates a responsive circulatory system so that it's responding to the needs for oxygen of all the tissues in the body. So from your toe to your brain, your diaphragm is involved in this. So yes, you can direct it, but you've got to understand that you're directing your breathing, that you're not just sort of tensing a muscle in what appears to be the location you want to contact. And to do that, you've got to know your diaphragm, you know, and we have these bodily organs, don't we? That's us. We live with them. We don't really know them. We don't even talk to them. We don't say thank you to them. They're all performing roles, but very few of us could describe what they are. And they wouldn't be able to discuss either what holds them all together, how they all connect. And in fact, they all connect to a wonderful web. It's like a fiber optic web called fascia, of which the diaphragm is made. And this fascia that surrounds all your organs connects with the diaphragm. The main artery and the main vein and your esophagus go through your diaphragm, right? And are affected by the diaphragm as you breathe, as it moves. It also helps to pulse onto them. And the vagus nerve, which a lot of people have heard of, that goes through the gap where the esophagus goes into the diaphragm. So it's feeding all that information into the diaphragm as well. Diaphragm has a lot to contend with, and it's your breathing affects your heart rate very much as well. And diaphragm has reflex.
Okay. So you discovered this and you used it to help your son dramatically improve his condition. What does your practice look like today? Like, who do you and how?
Who do I help? Well, children with autism, children with cerebral palsy, children with various symptoms, anyone who has a neurological condition. We help people with anxiety, panic attacks. We help people who have various illnesses, because when your diaphragm is central to your immune system, because it drives the lymph around the body. And the lymph flow, as you probably know, is your body's main detoxifying system. So if your diaphragm is weaker and exhausted trying to help you, it needs some help to continue to help you. So we have people who have been sick in many ways, people who think they've got long COVID, that's what they're diagnosed with. But usually when that sort of condition arises, when you trace back into their history, you can see a whole lot of very clear reasons why they have reacted as they did. And this just tipped them over. That made them different. And of course, when you look back into the fetal origins of the situation, you can see that there are variations because of the frequency, intensity, duration, and timing of the drop in oxygen, which each individual person has experienced one way or another. So it's very nice. And I treat over Skype. I treat over Skype and Zoom. And so a whole variety of different conditions work very well over that. And it's lovely treating the children because in a way over Skype you see them in their home environment too. So I give a consultation and then we have the training sessions, which the training, it's very, very, very light, gentle pressures. We hear, don't we? And hearing is the movement of air. But we don't feel that movement of air. And so it goes into the fluid in the cochlea of the ear. And this movement of the fluid, which has been generated from the movement of the air from the outside, then affects the nerves in the cochlea, and we translate that into sound. We don't really think about it. But all the time, bodies creating fluctuating movements within the fluid. Our bodies are mostly fluid. Our cells are fluid. So there is a language there. And once I had seen the connection between that language of pressure and switching on genetic material and electromagnetic field and just the movement of blood, and then I looked at fetal breathing and I looked what the infant did after it was born as well. And I thought, what I have to do is to replicate that. And we had equipment called inductive computerized respiratory plethysmography, which is actually good to say. And this is a computerized registration of the breathing pattern of the upper thorax and the breathing pattern of the diaphragm below. So this was very interesting too, because you could see even, say, before the children had any length of time with the exercises, you could see how their breathing was before you applied the exercises, and as soon as you applied them, you could see a difference. And you saw a difference between children with cerebral palsy who breathed very fast. The diaphragm was very effortful and flat, and they breathed fast. And sometimes there was very little at the top, or if there was, it was also very fast, because a baby's diaphragm is very flat, which is why a baby breathes fast initially in order to get sufficient oxygen, and then the work it does on its own diaphragm helps to strengthen it. Children with a diagnosis of autism and those people with anxiety, they breathe very differently, because you could see the upper chest movement in emotional patterns, stopping and starting, a little breath holding, a little quick, a little slow, another pause. And either that was dragging the diaphragm in or it was really dominating the diaphragm. So these were very different. So we could see the difference when you actually applied the exercises. And we could also see after 6 months that whatever diagnosis you had, the diaphragm movements were so much more normal and typical and nice. And you could also see, of course, everybody's posture was so much better, and symptomatically their symptoms were consequently reduced. But an interesting thing about the young baby, which I think is quite something to consider, is that when the baby is born, it's oxygen limited. It can only make very tiny little movements. So, and these little movements come from the little springy joints. So baby is searching for pleasure. Its little springy movements are nice. So it's been videoed. They make literally tens of little rhythmical coordinated patterns of movement. So these movements help to strengthen their diaphragm, and then they have more oxygen nutrition to help them make stronger movements, which strengthen the diaphragm still more. So it's beautiful balance between supply and demand. As we get older, we forget that balance. So we will push ourselves in different ways, or find that we are pushed by external forces, so that we are already borderline stressing the diaphragm, and we don't walk enough. Walking is very nice because the muscles between the pelvis and the diaphragm are helping to work as we move, and with each step that we take, they're moving, and our breathing is moving up and down into our abdomen. So that's really giving a wonderful deep internal massage and bringing health into our bodies. We don't do that enough. We're not intended to live in a civilized state, basically.
Well, very good, Linda. How can people find out more about your work? Do you have a book out? How can they find more resources? Do you have a website? Where can people go to learn more about you?
Yes. The website is www.lindascotson.co.uk. And that will take you to my website, but on the bar at the top, you can go into the children's website as well. So you can see it from both points of view. But there are a couple of little videos on my website, and a lot about the diaphragm very directly, that will help you to understand that before you if you want to, then need to go into the children's website. off the bar.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Good breathing.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.